there is a peculiar thing that happens when you stop trying to bend the world to your will. At first, it feels as though you are abandoning the very steering wheel of life, letting the current take you where it may. But look closely just beneath that initial sensation of free fall. There is a subtle shift, a transformation almost too quiet to notice. It is as if, the moment you loosen your grip on life, life itself leans in, curious, as though opening its ancient eyes after a long sleep. We already taught from the very beginning that existence is something to be managed, organized, fenced in, and conquered. The world is presented like a wild horse that must be tamed, or a puzzle that demands solving before we can rest. And so we grow tense, not only in the body but in the mind, tight with the habit of striving. We believe that, unless we push, prod, and pressure ourselves, nothing meaningful will happen. We fear that if we do not force life to bloom, it will wither. But surrender, you see, is not the resignation of the defeated, it is the relaxation of someone who has finally recognized the nature of things. When you stop fighting the river carries you, and it has always been carrying you, whether you noticed or not. Imagine for a moment that you are sitting beside a vast lake, perfectly still. The surface reflects the sky like a luminous mirror. Now toss a stone into it. The ripples distort the reflection, breaking it into trembling fragments. This is what the mind does when it grasps too tightly, when it insists on control. It throws stones into the water of life, and then grows troubled by the waves it created. When you stop throwing stones, the lake reveals what was always there. But surrender is not something you can do. It is something that happens when you stop doing. It is the art of unclenching the fist that has been gripping reality so hard it forgot the hand could open. When we align ourselves with the movement of life rather than push against it, something extraordinary becomes visible, not because it wasn't there before, but because we finally cleared the surface enough to see. People often mistake surrender for passivity, yet nothing could be further from the truth. Passivity is a kind of numbness, a retreat from experience. Surrender is the opposite. It is the willingness to meet life fully without hiding behind resistance. It means trusting that life, in all its chaos and unpredictability, is fundamentally tending toward growth, toward expression, toward awakening. And here is the great twist. The world does not open its eyes when you conquer it or when you finally wrestle it into your preferred shape. It opens when you open, when your expectations loosen, when your compulsive attempts to direct every detail soften into curiosity. Then the world responds, not like a servant obeying orders, but like a partner in a dance. Because life, at its core, is movement, fluid, rhythmic, improvisational. It was never meant to be controlled, only participated in. And when you surrender to that dance, life recognizes you. Something in the fabric of reality lifts its head, as though saying, "Oh, there you are." And perhaps the most astonishing part is that this recognition feels like remembering rather than discovering, as though the world was always awake, always present, always aware, but you were moving too quickly, thinking too loudly, striving too intensely to notice its gaze. The moment surrender begins, even in the faintest whisper, life seems to lean forward, listening, not because you've earned its attention, but because you've stopped drowning out its voice. You may recall moments, brief, flickering moments when this quiet clarity emerged unexpectedly. Perhaps you were walking in the early morning, when the world is still soft around the edges, and for no reason at all you felt a strange sense of harmony with everything. Or you were watching rain slide down a window, losing yourself in the patterns, and suddenly the boundary between you and the scene became thin, almost transparent. These are not mystical experiences reserved for sages or saints. They are glimpses of what happens when the inner resistance relaxes, when the world can reflect itself without distortion. You see, the desire to control is rooted in fear that life is fundamentally unsafe, unreliable, or indifferent. We imagine ourselves as small creatures set against a vast, uncaring cosmos. And so we arm ourselves with plans, schedules, ambitions, identities, all in the desperate attempt to secure some measure of certainty. But the irony of course, is that the more tightly we attempt to secure life, the more it slips through our fingers. Trying to control life is like trying to hold water in your hands. Cup your palms gently, and the water rests there. Squeeze even the slightest bit, and it spills away. Surrender is the gentle cupping. It is the understanding that life cannot be possessed, only received. Now, consider a different image. A door that has always been unlocked. Yet for years you've been pushing against it with all your weight. You strain, sweat, perhaps even curse the stubborn door, convinced that only by force will it open. One day, in exhaustion, you stop pushing, and the moment you lean back, the door swings inward effortlessly. It was meant to be pulled all along. Surrender is that subtle leaning back, that release of unnecessary effort. It is the insight that life often opens in the direction opposite to where we've been pushing. People often ask, but if I surrender, won't I become passive, directionless, or weak? They imagine themselves dissolving into the currents like a leaf with no will of its own. But surrender is not the loss of will, it is the alignment of will with the natural order of things. A skilled surfer does not fight the wave. They ride it. They do not surrender by giving up, they surrender by attuning themselves to a force far greater than their own. And in doing so, they become powerful. Surrender, then, is not submission, but cooperation, not defeat, but participation. It is the recognition that life is not happening to you or against you, but with you. When you understand this, your actions become more precise, your decisions clearer, your presence more vibrant. You are no longer tangled in the exhausting effort to manipulate every moment. Instead, you become receptive, aware, capable of responding rather than reacting. And it is precisely in that receptive state that the world opens its eyes to you, because now you are capable of seeing it, not through the fog of expectation or the haze of fear, but directly, plainly, intimately, as though the universe has taken your hand and whispered, "Shall we walk together?" And as you walk with that quiet openness, life begins to reveal subtleties that were always present but previously overlooked. A breeze is no longer just moving air, but a kind of conversation between the sky and the earth. The way sunlight travels across a wall becomes a delicate choreography, a silent play performed only once in that exact form. Even the sound of distant traffic turns into a kind of urban ocean, waves rising and falling with their own peculiar rhythm. When resistance softens, perception widens. But hear this clearly, surrender does not mean eliminating all effort. It is not some sterile neutrality where one drifts without intention. Rather, it is an intelligent recognition of when effort serves harmony and when effort disrupts it. It is a sensitivity, a listening, a kind of inner musician, learning to play in tune with the orchestra of existence. For example, imagine a bird on a high branch. When the wind blows, the bird does not resist by gripping the branch desperately, nor does it passively accept being tossed about. Instead, it adjusts swings, shifting slightly, body leaning into the breeze. This is effort, yes, but an effortless effort. When the conditions are right, it lifts off, not by conquering the air, but by cooperating with it. That is surrender. The graceful intelligence of knowing when to move, when to eschew, when to let go, and when to leap. A great deal of human suffering arises because we treat every moment as a problem to be solved. We think life is a project, an assignment, a puzzle with one correct solution. And so, we live in a constant state of tension, preparing for obstacles that may never appear, bracing ourselves against imagined threats, trying to anticipate every possible twist and turn, like someone who walks with their fists clenched, even when no danger is present. But consider this. Life is not a puzzle. It is a mystery. And the way you approach a mystery is entirely different. A puzzle demands resolution. A mystery invites participation. A puzzle narrows your attention. A mystery expands it. A puzzle ends when you find the answer. A mystery deepens when you discover you are part of it. When you surrender, You allow the world to be mysterious without treating it as hostile. You cease demanding that life conform to your plans. You stop insisting that reality bend to your expectations. And suddenly, something astonishing happens. Your plans become lighter, your expectations less rigid, and your experience more vivid. You begin to notice the extraordinary in the ordinary, kind of noticing that children do so naturally, before they are trained to prioritize control over wonder. There is a softness to this way of being, but it is not fragility. It is the softness of water, which yields yet carves mountains. It is the softness of a horizon, which you can never grasp, yet endlessly approaches. It is the softness of breath itself, something so subtle, so easily overlooked, yet carrying your entire existence moment by moment. This is why surrender is not weakness. It is an invitation to live from the subtle, the spacious, the immediate. It is an awakening to the fact that the world has always been more alive, more intelligent, more responsive than we imagined. And as you soften your grip, this aliveness becomes undeniable. The world opens its eyes the moment you stop insisting that yours must remain narrowed. As this aliveness becomes undeniable, something else begins to shift, something subtle, yet profound. You start to sense that life is not merely happening around you. It is happening through you. The boundary between the inner world and the outer world grows porous, almost transparent. Thoughts move like clouds across a sky that does not resist them. Feelings rise and fall like tides guided by a moon whose pull you no longer need to fear. And in this permeability, this openness, you find a kind of ease that effort could never produce. The attempt to control life often comes from the belief that you are separate from an isolated point of consciousness observing a world out there. But surrender invites a new perception that you and the world are woven from the same fabric, breathing in rhythm, unfolding together like two petals of a single blossom. And when you sense this unity, however faintly, the urge to dominate life fades, replaced by an almost childlike wonder that such a dance exists at all. You may begin to notice, for instance, how events arrive in their own timing, not yours. There are seasons in your life just as there are seasons in nature. Some periods are like spring, full of beginnings and delicate shoots of possibility. Others are like summer, vibrant and overflowing with activity. Still others resemble autumn, when things fall away, not as punishment but as preparation. And finally, winter arrives quiet, bare, inward turning when life seems to withdraw, but only to gather strength for another cycle. If you try to force summer during winter, frustration arises, but if you surrender to the season you are in, a deeper intelligence becomes visible. You begin to understand that life grows and rests, expands and contracts, without needing your constant supervision. You become less concerned with pushing and more interested in listening for the subtle cues of your own inner landscape. Listening for the quiet rhythms of existence that whisper, not now, or wait, or this way. This listening is not passive. It is a creative participation, an attunement to the unfolding moment. It is like learning to play music, not by rigidly following notes on a page, but by hearing the music as it lives and breathes. When a musician surrenders to the music plays them as much as they play it. The boundary dissolves. Action arises from a deeper place than intention alone. And this, too, is the nature of surrender. It allows life to act through you with a clarity that your conscious will could never muster. Decisions feel less like decisions and more like natural movements, like turning your head toward a sound you intuitively recognize, or stepping aside before realizing why. You begin to trust these movements, these impulses, because they arise not from fear or compulsion, but from alignment with something larger, something profoundly wise. This alignment is not mystical, though it may feel that way. It is simply what happens when resistance falls away. Clarity emerges. The mind becomes a clear sky rather than a storm. And in that sky, the world appears as it truly is, not an adversary to be conquered, nor a prize to be claimed, but a partner in a dance far older than your memory. And as this recognition deepens, something else becomes clear as well. Surrender is not a single act. It is a moment-to-moment willingness to stop interfering with what is already unfolding. It is the courage to exhale again and again, knowing that the next breath will always return. Life breathes you just as you breathe it. And in that shared breath, the world opens its eyes more fully, not because it has changed, but because you have, as you begin to see that the world opens its eyes in rhythm with your own softening. A natural curiosity arises. What else have I been holding on to without knowing it? Because surrender is not merely the release of control over external events, it is the release of inner tension, inner certainties, inner narratives that you've mistaken for truth. And when those soften, the landscape within becomes as spacious as the one without. You might discover, for example, that much of what you've called yourself is a collage of old stories, ideas inherited from parents, teachers, culture, and the long shadows of memory. Stories about what success means, what failure means, what you should fear, what you should desire, who you ought to become, and who you must avoid becoming at all costs. These stories cling like vines around a tree, shaping its growth, yet never being the tree itself. Surrender loosens these vines, not by tearing them away, because force only tightens what it tries to remove, but by allowing them to fall on their own, in their own timing, as the tree grows more fully into itself. When you stop insisting on who you must be, you begin to feel who you already are beneath all the narratives. This can be disorienting, even unsettling. To surrender the false self requires a certain bravery, because what remains is openness. And openness can feel like vulnerability. Yet it is only in vulnerability that genuine strength appears, the kind of strength that does not rely on armor, certainty, or control, but on presence. Think of the sky again. The sky does not resist the storm, nor does it cling to the clouds when they pass. Its openness is its strength. It can hold anything and lose nothing. You, too, have this quality when you surrender the rigid boundaries of identity. You become a space through which life flows, not a structure that must defend itself against every gust of wind. Now, you may wonder how this translates into daily living. After all, life is not lived in abstractions, but in conversations, decisions, relationships, responsibilities. But surrender does not distance you from the practical world. It brings you closer to it. Because when you are not tangled in internal conflicts, you meet the moment directly without the haze of expectation or fear. In a conversation, surrender means listening without preparing your response in advance. It means letting the other person be without pushing your agenda onto their words. In making decisions, surrender means sensing the movement of your life rather than forcing outcomes that contradict your deeper intuition. In relationships, surrender means allowing space for growth, space for uncertainty, space for the mystery of another person's inner world. Strangely, when you stop clinging to people, they feel freer around you. When you stop clinging to outcomes, your actions become more fluid and effective. When you stop clinging to identity, creativity blossoms. This isn't magic, it's the natural consequence of releasing the inner tension that once narrowed your vision. You see, control is exhausting because it requires constant maintenance. Surrender is spacious because it requires none. The moment you surrender, the energy once spent on holding everything together becomes available for living. Life becomes less like a battle and more like a conversation, one in which you finally hear your own voice clearly because you are no longer shouting over the world. And it is in this quiet, unclenched listening that you begin to sense something profound. The world is not a stranger you must tame or protect yourself from. It is an intimate companion, responding to your inner state with extraordinary precision. When you soften, it softens. When you open, it opens. And eventually, you come to realize that the world was never asleep at all. It merely mirrored the state of your own awareness, waiting patiently for the moment you chose to awaken. As this awakening ripples through your experience, another realization dawns. Surrender is not something you achieve once and for all. It is a rhythm, a pulse, a constant invitation offered in every situation, every thought, every breath. Life presents you with a moment, and you have the choice again and again to tighten or to soften, to resist or to allow, to contract or to open. Sometimes you will find yourself grasping again, tightening your hold on a person, a plan, a belief. And that's perfectly natural. The mind is conditioned to cling. It clings because it imagines that without its constant interference, everything will collapse. But surrender is simply the willingness to notice this clinging without condemning it, to see the moment of tension and gently, patiently release it, like letting go of a rope you didn't realize you were pulling on. And here is the beauty. Each time you release, even a little, the world reveals another layer of its subtle intelligence. You may notice how conversations unfold differently when you don't try to direct them, how problems unravel themselves when you stop wrestling with them, how insight arrives in the quiet spaces where you once filled the air with worry. It's almost as if life has been waiting behind a thin curtain, tapping its foot, saying, "Whenever you're ready." And surrender is the drawing back of that curtain. Consider for a moment how a flower opens. It does not pry its petals apart with effort or strain. It participates in a natural unfolding guided by conditions it does not control. The warmth of sunlight, the softness of rain, the gentle turning of the earth. Yet the flower does not feel powerless. It is, in fact, the perfect expression of power, not the power to dominate, but the power to become itself. You are not so different. The conditions of your life, the joys, the losses, the surprises, the quiet moments are the sunlight and rain that shape your unfolding. When you surrender to these conditions, rather than resent or resist them, you begin to bloom in ways you could never have forced. You become an expression of something far deeper than intention, the natural intelligence of being. And with this blooming comes a new kind of perception. You begin to notice synchronicities not as magical interventions from outside, but as the byproduct of inner alignment. When you are no longer in conflict with yourself, your actions, thoughts, and circumstances resonate. They fit together effortlessly, like pieces of a puzzle finding their place without being forced. Life feels less like a series of obstacles and more like a series of invitations. You might find yourself saying, "I don't know why, but something feels right about this choice," or "I don't understand it yet, but I feel drawn this way." This intuition is not mystical. It is the clarity that emerges when noise subsides. When the mind is not cluttered by the need to control, it becomes a more faithful instrument of perception. And through this clarity, you begin to trust yourself. Not the self built on stories or defenses, but the quiet self, beneath a one that does not shout, but whispers. The one that knows how to move without forcing, how to speak without rehearsing, how to live without clinging. This trust is one of surrender's greatest gifts, because ultimately, surrender is not about trusting life instead of yourself. It is trusting that you and life are not separate at all, that the same intelligence moving the rivers and the wind is moving your heart, that the world opens its eyes the moment you realize you are never walking alone. And in this realization, another door opens, one that leads deeper still. As you move through this newly opened door, you encounter a kind of stillness that is not the absence of movement, but the presence of depth. It is like standing at the edge of a vast ocean. At dusk, everything around you, quiet, yet full of hidden motion beneath the surface. This stillness is not something you create. It is something revealed when the constant noise of control subsides. And in that stillness, you begin to sense the subtle pulse of existence itself. This pulse is always here, always available, yet easily drowned out by the busy narrative of "I must," "I should," "I have to." When surrender softens these compulsions, you hear the more delicate rhythm beneath, the rhythm of simply being, a rhythm that does not demand progress, achievement, or explanation. It asks nothing of you except presence. Presence is the natural consequence of surrender because presence can only exist where resistance is absent. When you are not fighting the moment, you are in the moment. When you are not trying to escape life, you are finally able to experience it. And in presence, the world becomes remarkably vivid, the colors richer, the sounds fuller, the sensations more textured. It is as if life has turned up the volume on reality. You may notice, for example, that simple actions carry a kind of quiet perfection. Washing your hands becomes a small ceremony of warmth and motion. Drinking water becomes a communion with something ancient. Even standing in line becomes a moment of stillness where you can feel the breath moving gently in your chest. Surrender sharpens perception, not by effort, but by the removal of interference. And in this heightened perception, you may come upon a startling awareness. Life has never been distant or opaque. It has always been intimate. It has always been speaking. But its language is subtle, and subtlety cannot be heard by a mind preoccupied with control. This intimacy reveals itself most clearly in moments of uncertainty, when plans fall apart, when something unexpected disrupts your path. The habitual response is panic or frustration in inner tightening. But when you meet uncertainty with surrender, something remarkable happens. Uncertainty transforms from an enemy into a guide. Instead of demanding answers, you listen. Instead of forcing a direction, you sense the next step. It is like walking through a forest at night with only a lantern. You cannot see the entire path, only the next few feet. But that is enough. The lantern does not reveal the whole forest. It reveals only what is needed in each moment. Surrender is the willingness to trust that limited illumination, to move without possessing the entire map. And strangely, this partial vision brings a kind of peace. When you stop insisting that you must know everything, you realize that you already know enough. Life becomes less about predicting the future and more about participating in the present. And this participation draws you into a deeper harmony with the unfolding of events, a harmony that feels both mysterious and profoundly natural. You begin to see that surrender is not the abandonment of action, but the refinement of action. When you act from surrender, your movements are cleaner, freer, less entangled in fear. You no longer act to secure your identity or protect your story. You act from clarity, from presence, from the spontaneous intelligence of the moment. And as this way of living deepens, you can feel the world respond not with fanfare or dramatic revelation, but with a quiet companionship. A sense that life is meeting you halfway, organizing itself around your openness, as if the world, too, has been waiting for the moment you stop pushing so it can finally come forward. And in this mutual recognition, another layer of surrender becomes possible, one that leads to the heart of the mystery. And as you approach the heart of this mystery, you begin to sense something so simple, so quietly obvious, that the mind almost overlooks it. Surrender is the recognition that you were never truly separate from life to begin with. The entire drama of struggle, control, resistance, this great performance of trying to manage existence rests upon the assumption of a distance that was never there. When this illusion softens, even slightly, what replaces it is not knowledge, not doctrine, not philosophy, but a direct meeting with the living moment. You discover that life has always been happening in concert with you, never against you. That the movements you once called yours and the movements you once called the world are part of the same unfolding gesture, like two waves rising from a single ocean. This recognition does not arrive as a grand revelation. It arrives like dawn. First a faint brightening, then a gradual soft illumination, until suddenly the landscape is visible in its entirety. And what you see is profoundly liberating. There is no need to clutch at life, because life is already holding you. Surrender, then, is a homecoming, a return to the ease that was present even in your earliest moments, before the mind learned to divide existence into fragments, before you were taught to chase certainty, to secure identity, to brace against the unknown. In surrender, you rediscover the natural poise of being in innocence, not of ignorance, but of presence. And with this return comes an unexpected gift, compassion, not the forced, moral kind, but a spontaneous warmth that flows naturally when you are no longer defending yourself against the world. When you stop struggling, you begin to see that everyone else is struggling in their own way. Fearing, hoping, resisting, you see the same tension in others that once lived in you, and your heart softens, not out of obligation, but out of recognition. This compassion extends inward as well. You begin to forgive yourself for the years spent tightening, worrying, striving. You understand that control was never a flaw, it was a misunderstanding, a natural stage in the unfolding of awareness, and as you forgive yourself, something inside relaxes even more deeply, allowing life to move through you with greater clarity, greater gentleness. Eventually, surrender becomes less an act and more a way of being. It becomes the quiet posture with which you meet each moment, not leaning forward in grasping, not leaning back in avoidance, but resting in the simple fact of presence. You no longer need to impose meaning on life, because the meaning reveals itself in the very act of experiencing it. And it is airy in this quiet equilibrium that the world opens its eyes most fully, not as something separate or distant or mysterious, but as something intimate, participatory, profoundly alive. You feel yourself breathed by the same rhythm that moves the tides, stirred by the same wind that bends the trees. You are not standing in the world. You are standing as the world looking back at itself with newfound clarity. In this recognition, the final veil falls away. You realize that surrender is not a loss, but a revelation. Not an ending, but a beginning. Not a collapse into passivity, but an opening into the fullness of being. And in that opening, life meets you completely, tenderly, unmistakably. The moment you surrender, the world opens its eyes.